Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. Defence Minister Arun Jaitley's recent retort to the Chinese bullying over Doklam standoff and the response it evoked from China sum up the new reality of Sino-Indian relations. Jaitley said India was no longer the India of 1962 and China replied it was also not the China of 1962. Even though both meant something else, the fact is the two countries have come a long way from just being inimical neighbours. Bilateral and global conflict completely changed from 1962. China may be a bigger military and economic power than India, but it can hardly afford a military conflict today. During the past few years, Chinese President Xi Jinping has unleashed a grand propaganda for image makeover of the country. China does not want to be perceived as a bigger, richer and more powerful North Korea. In his first speech to the World Economic Forum at Davos in January, Xi surprised the world by defending economic globalization and speaking against emerging protectionist trends all over the world. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze if India should recalibrate its China policy. Joining me on the program today are Srikanth Kondapalli, Professor, Chinese Studies, JNU, Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee, Consulting Editor, The Business Standard, Ashok Sajanhar, former Ambassador, and Alok Bansal, Director, India Foundation. Professor, I'd like to begin with you. Of course, the rhetoric has been high as far as tensions at the border in Sikkim are concerned. But clearly, both the countries, neither India nor China, want to escalate it any further.
Indeed, I think the level of confrontation is at the media level as of now, and also in terms of the Chinese Foreign Ministry statements, including Chinese ambassador statements and the political counselor Li's statement today on YouTube on this issue. On the other side, India had not as much articulated at the Ministry of External Affairs, or except for the one statement that it had issued, or the Ministry of Defense, except again the Chief of Army Staff's visit to Sikkim. So in other words, it remained a war of words rather than actual war on the ground. But the
rhetoric remains high as far as the media is concerned.
That's right. And also the preparation is relatively higher than compared with the 2013 Depsang plane incident, where 1,000 troops were mobilized, or Tumor incident in 2014 or 2015, September, November, where 200 troops were mobilized. This time it is 3,000 each. So in other words, there is a slightly higher quantitative increase in the presence. However, we have not seen a large-scale mobilization on either side. So that's the positive aspect of this. So it remains contained to the diplomatic media levels.
Diplomatic channels, of course, have been a buzz as far as this particular incident is concerned. But Alok Bansal, the issue as such, the Sikkim issue, do you believe that it's going to, what has led to the escalation so far? Because these kind of skirmishes keep happening. It's not new, but it's dealt at the local level. What has led to this?
See, the first thing is that this area where this has happened, there has never been any incident like this. So it's a fresh area, it's a new area, and obviously since there was no dispute as far as this was concerned, as far as India was concerned, Chinese had never come in. So we have also reacted. But if you see the media rhetoric, especially in Chinese media for last 3-4 days, it's been at a very, very high level. I think the way the Chinese embassy has gone ahead and gone to the media, has issued statements which have come on YouTube and things like that, it shows that Chinese are raising the ante. And now if that is the case, such minor incidents can become serious. And already, as Professor Srikanth Kondapalli said, the troops mobilization on both sides is fairly high. The second important thing is that the place where this has happened is tactically very, very important. It's a platform where you can virtually move into Indian territory if you actually want to come. Its location is a very, very critical part. And from India's point of view, yielding Chinese an upper hand into that particular area could be catastrophic. So I think it will be resisted. And time, I think, has come for certain amount of diplomatic maneuvers, and I think at a higher level we need to negotiate. Otherwise, such incidents can often spiral out of control, and
Sure.
that's where I'm a little concerned, because you have large troops mobilization. One wrong step anywhere could lead to aggravation of.
Ambassador, how can India leverage China? I mean, what are India's diplomatic tools?
You know, Frank, just to give a little bit of a background, meaning of course it is in a manner similar to what the other incidents of this nature have been. But there is a difference here, because earlier all the other instances have been directly between India and China, whether it is Depsang or it is Chumar or the other incidents. This is the first time that you have the involvement of, so to say, a third party, that is Bhutan. And what the Chinese have been questioning is that how is India in a territory which they claim theirs, which Bhutan says is disputed, and India is going there because of its special relationship with Bhutan, and because, as has been mentioned, it has such serious implications as far as our own security and strategic interests, both as far as the Siliguri corridor, the Chicken's Neck, and also the Arunachal Pradesh is concerned. So in that sense, it becomes very, very critical and very, very crucial. Now, I'll say, as far as, responding to your question, well, the diplomatic possibilities have always been available. The doors both in Delhi and in Beijing, in terms of conversation, have always been open. Now, this is true that this is unprecedented. It is this sort of a rhetoric we have not seen earlier. And while you mentioned about Mr. Jaitley's comment, meaning anyone and all of us who would have watched it, would have seen that it really came as an off-the-cuff remark, because he was talking to media and this question was sort of, put in, and he responded. But the response that came from the Chinese side was from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and that came after 2 days. That means it was a very well-thought and well-considered response that they were giving. I think as far as India is concerned, our response has been very mature, very measured. The only statement that we came out was on the 30th of June, where we have recounted what happened, but we also said that we should restore the status quo. Because the change of the status quo has very serious adverse implications for our security.
Right.
So when we are talking about diplomacy, I think what we really need, where we have to see where we are now, and the final end objective is that status quo ante before 16th of June needs to be restored. That is, the Chinese are no longer coming in to construct their road, and the Indian troops are not there, so that both of them pull back.
Right.
Now the Chinese have said that you withdraw unilaterally because this is our territory, and otherwise if you withdraw in a dignified manner, it's all right. Otherwise you will be humiliated and you will be thrown out. I think this sort of a rhetoric needs to be done away with, and I'm glad that it has not come from our side, because from their side it has been the official media, it has been the Global Times and the People's Daily. From our side, it's been the private channels. But Ministry of External Affairs and Ministry of Defense, they have been quiet, and I think there must be some sort of back channel possibilities that must be getting explored.
Back channel dialogue is what is required at this point in time, is what you're suggesting. But Shubhama Bhattacharya, I'd like to bring you into the picture now. From an economic point of view, let's put Sikkim aside for the time being, and talk about the entire India-China conundrum as such. Do you believe that further escalation of the problem or any kind of tensions between the two countries is the last thing that both nations need from an economic point of view?
Right, Frank. I mean, and in fact, very good points that have been made by Mr. Bansal, Mr. Konapalli, and Mr. Sajjanhar. And I was listening to it very carefully, and that's so. What the question that automatically arises by listening to them is that what is the reason why China is escalating it? It's not for getting a presence in Bhutan, I would say, or any other place. What is happening is a supremacy of economic power. China is very, very wedded to the OBOR, the One Belt, One Road principle. And that is something on which India, having said no to it, has been a bruising development. Now, here you can see what China is doing is that it is going up to India's neighbors, Nepal, Bhutan, one by one, and sort of telling them that you abandon India and come over to our area of influence. Now, that is something we don't know how it will play out. But what's happening is that here there is a quest between the two countries, especially China looks at it, that who is going to hold the right of economic hegemony in Asia and correspondingly across the world. And that is the prize for which they are basically squaring off against India.
So the turning point, would you say, then, was the Obor meet?
It is, and definitely it is something on which they are mighty cut up. Now, that brings me to the second point, that our reaction to what is happening with the China developments should be looked at in terms of what is the next and the subsequent steps they can take. Now, you know, none of these developments are isolated in the sense that they are not provocation and then, you know, sort of a reprisal or a quick response. It is being thought through. I mean, despite what His Excellency Mr. Sajjan is saying, that I would think Beijing is directly involved in it in each of the steps, even though they are open to negotiations and discussions. So, which means that we need to see to what level they are willing to escalate and what is the reason why they would escalate it. What is the prize that they are looking for? It's obviously not territory per se, it is economic supremacy. Now, what and why does this particular standoff, where does it fit into that overall narrative? And only when we do that sort of a homework, and I'm sure it's being done here in the concerned ministries, would we be able to have a coherent and a thought through response to what can be done with the current standoff.
Those are some very valid points that you raised there. Professor Kondapalli, do you believe that India, because of the points that Shubham has just raised, India needs to really recalibrate its China policy as such?
I think the current standoff in Sikkim, Bhutan is also linked to the factor that China wants to be a big player in the South Asian region. As with the other regions of Asia, East Asia, we saw the responses, for example, on the Senkaku Islands recently. Some 648 transgressions happen on the Senkaku Islands every year. And the Filipino activity in South China Sea and changing position towards that. The vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, Phan Chang Lung, visited Hanoi and warned the Vietnamese not to drill in the Paracels Islands, which suggests basically that they on sovereignty issues and on energy economic issues, they would like to have more forays in these regions. Also, with the Singaporeans, when they conducted the Starlight exercise program with Taiwan, the Hong Kong harbor had captured or rather put up in their custody the vessels which were part of the Starlight exercise. And it's only after Singapore had agreed to provide consent to China on the One Belt, One Road and a host of other issues that the vessel was released. So in other words, many of these are linked to the as the previous speaker had mentioned about the leadership issues in Asia as well. So in other words, then India needs to recalibrate by also actively engaging with all the regions of Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, West Asia, as well as East Asia. So in other words, it has to have a more active strategic policy towards the Asian region.
Indeed. What is it that India can offer some of these strategic allies, Ambassador, that China can't?
Well, in my way of thinking, I don't think it is that India wants these countries to be completely under its umbrella, that they don't have relations with China or whatever, or there should be, the principal country in that region should be India. I think we are quite all right if these countries have good, productive, fruitful relations with China, as long as they do not impinge on our security or our strategic interests. I think that is what, whether it is Nepal or
India
it is,
might want it, but can India and China coexist, say for instance, in a Nepal?
I think there are possibilities, because there are a large number of countries in other areas where you have two big powers, and both of them, it really depends upon that concerned power also as to how it deals with, how it handles these countries. For instance, I'll give you the example of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has 7,000 kilometer long boundary with Russia, 1,500 kilometer long boundary with China. They have excellent relations with both of them. So I think it really depends upon that country also. So it depends upon Nepal also. Earlier they were playing the China card with us. They were taking benefits from both sides. So I think it is not in the interest of any of these countries also to go and be in one, either China or India camp. And India is not interested in having these countries in your camp, as long as there are productive and fruitful relations with these countries. And that is what we have been trying to engage them now. That, we don't want a complete sort of, monopoly of the relations. But our, for instance, like the nuclear-powered submarine came to Sri Lanka. I mean, those are issues which are of very significant concern for us. And those should be avoided. Those should be taken care of.
Talking about submarines and talking about joint exercises, Alok Bansal, there is a major joint exercise coming up between India, US and Japan is also joining in the Indian Ocean region. Clearly, that's on the mind of the Chinese, because they have increased their presence in the Indian Ocean region. Of late, we've seen hectic activity from the PLA in the Indian Ocean region. There has been a submarine that has been deployed recently, and also several battleships. So clearly, that's on the mind of the Chinese.
See, one thing that China has never wanted was that India should become part of a multilateral alliance which is perceived to be anti-China. I think they haven't objected to bilateral exercises. In fact, once we had done in Bay of Bengal a four-nation exercise involving India, US, Japan and Australia, and Chinese had reacted very strongly. Of late, we have been doing multilateral exercises. This is a recent development where we have been going to East Asia, East China Sea, etc. We have done certain exercises off Japanese coast, etc. And I think this exercise is also being done in Indian Ocean. It does raise hackles in China, because, as I said, China is only concerned about this part, that India should not become part of a multilateral alliance which is perceived to be anti-China. As far as India's neighborhood is concerned, you talked about nuclear submarine coming to Colombo, etc. I think let one thing be very clear, that China may be wanting to increase its influence, to use them as a leverage against India. Apart from Pakistan, no other country in the region would want to take a side if tensions increase. And the diktats of geography is that in Nepal, China can never be a substitute for India. Similarly, it can't be in Bhutan. There is no way it can be a substitute for India in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka for that matter. So we have no problems with China's presence there. In fact, I was personally advocating that if China abandons CPEC, it would be worthwhile giving them an access to Kandla port or Mumbai port via Nepal, if they are so desirous of an access to Arabian Sea or something like that. So we have no problems. I don't think so Chinese presence in any of these countries will diminish our influence. And I think to that extent, I would like to, I'm reminded of that statement which former Sri Lankan president had made, Rajapaksa. He said that China is a good friend, but India is a relation. And in South Asian context, relations are for keeps. Friends may come and go.
Sure, okay. Shubham, of late we've seen several protests taking place in front of the Chinese embassy as well. Calls being made to boycott Chinese goods coming to India. I mean, is that even a viable option? Aren't there areas of coexistence between India and China?
Sure. I mean, those protests are, token, and they really don't amount to much. It's because, as we are seeing from everybody's comment, India, first of all, India is 1/5 the size of China in terms of the GDP. So we definitely can't do anything much there. Also, the fact remains that India has got a very accommodative stance in terms of the fact that we have been running a trade deficit with China. In fact, talks with China over several years for more access by Indian pharmaceutical companies into China or of software, India has been very accommodative. The interesting thing is that, you know, while it is clear that in Asia, that India and China definitely has lots of things to be proud of, it is also surprisingly the more prickly of the two countries. For instance, recently when India got accolades for being the fastest growing economy in the world, and when not only China reacted very strongly on that, remember India has never reacted on that. Similarly, when India went to USA and had a very strong meeting with President Trump, the Chinese media was quite scathing. Now, Indian media hardly ever comments on why China is being close to, say, Putin or any other geographic, any other leader. So you can see that bristling feeling coming from China, and it basically sort of, to me, it sort of gives a feeling that because those were absolutely one-sided act. I mean, India hadn't said anything particularly for China to get riled or rattled. That China regards the Asian neighborhood as something like it's, you know, like the Monroe Doctrine, its own neighborhood, where it is the supreme leader to which other countries should follow. Now, whether that happens or not, the point is that whenever it sees countries sort of not falling in tow,
Right.
it tries to react. I mean, look at the Malabar exercise. In the Malabar exercise, not only, it's not just this, I mean, the very interesting thing that you brought up, but over the years, especially from the time that USA has started sending its aircraft carriers to be part of the exercise, Chinese subs and frigates actually follow the exercise. They make their presence there, and they make it clear that they do look at this as something very, very unwelcome development in a patch of water which they consider their own.
Indeed. You know, Professor, Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi are to meet on the sidelines of the G20 summit. Do you believe that all these issues that have been taking place on the border are going to have any bearing on the meeting as such?
Well, if you remember the 2014 September, almost 8.5 hours, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping were together in Ahmedabad, and then came back to Delhi. They have had close sessions. I think that rapport between the two leaders, strong leaders in Asia, that is very important. Secondly, during that time there was a certain strategic consensus that has been evolved between the two leaders. So I think the personal rapport and the consensus, I think this is very important for the bilateral relations. We have seen lower level, tactical level responses so far. Strategic responses have not yet come up in the leadership as of now. And in the previous meeting, in the SEO summit meeting by lanes, Xi Jinping and Modi discussions were very casual, friendly, and so on, including on the Xi Jinping's praise on the Dangal movie that he had raised in the meeting. So in other words, the rapport has been pretty good. In other words, the Sikkim standoff will have a marginal kind of impact in their discussions in the Hamburg G20 meeting.
Sure.
Having said that, there is also Sikkim standoff, Sikkim-Bhutan standoff also had a certain series of events attached to it, and Masood Azhar case, the NSG case, so on. I've been CPEC case in the One Belt One Road summit meeting, and the investments raised in that project. I think there are these series of events that have been combined along with the Sikkim-Bhutan standoff. And I was told that this is the handiwork of a deputy foreign minister who had taken a relatively tough stance on India for the last 2 years or so.
Right.
And we are paying for that kind of position.
I've got 2 minutes left on the program, so I'm going to get quick comments from all my other guests as well. You know, Alok Bansal, the Prime Minister has been criticized by the opposition parties in India for not taking up, contentious issues with his counterparts abroad. Do you believe that some of these contentious issues will be raised?
I think this issue, they would try to resolve it, but no contentious issues, I think, should be raised. And as Professor Kondapalli said, I think the Sikkim-Bhutan standoff should not be seen in isolation. This has been a series of events: NSG, Masood Azhar, Dalai Lama's visit to Arunachal, and then now the recent statement which has come out from Chinese office saying that they would reconsider their opinion about status of Sikkim and Bhutan is even more crucial, because if this sort of stance goes on, I think there is no end to it, because India could also reconsider its stance on a lot of other territories, maybe Tibet or even Taiwan for that matter.
Sure.
So there are a lot of issues. While China is a bigger economy, and I have no doubts about it, but I don't think so there are any imports from China which are critical for India. It may raise the cost for Indian economy, but India is not dependent on them.
Okay.
Please understand, Chinese economy is far more globalized, and if a big chunk of markets are denied to it, it would probably suffer more in longer term.
All right. You know, Ambassador, the visit to Israel is also on the minds of the Chinese. They're closely watching everything that's happening in Israel. Is that going to have any kind of bearing with the relationship between India and China?
I think it adds one more layer of discomfort as far as China is concerned. But if you permit, one or two comments that have been made very quickly.
I'm running out of time.
Very quickly, I think the rapport that was established in September 2014 has been fraying at the edges as far as the two leaders are concerned. Because when Mr. Modi went to China in 2015, he got a good welcome. But a month before that, Xi Jinping had gone to Pakistan and declared the CPEC. And I think that is when the mind of the Chinese was made.
Right.
Last year, when Mr. Modi and Xi Jinping met in Tashkent at the SCO, I think that must still be rankling in the minds of the Prime Minister, that he told him about NSG. And Mr. Xi Jinping just waved it away.
Fair enough.
Today, in Astana when they met, I think there was an attempt to bring geniality and cordiality.
Right.
But this has again
I'm sorry to
muddied the
cut this short.
waters.
Running out of time
Muddied the
completely.
waters.
Quick closing comment from you, Shubhamay.
Well, the meeting between Mr. Xi Jinping and Mr. Modi has been called off. China's media has just reported saying the conditions are not right for this meeting to be held, and they will reconsider a fresh meeting.
Okay, fine. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have today. See you again next time.